now? There we go. So now everyone just be aware we're recording. And again, I'm Faith from the Concord Public Library, and I'm going to hand the attention over to Brett from the Sleep Center. And Brett, maybe if you could just get started with a quick introduction about yourself before we get into the juicy parts. So
sure.
Okay, so everyone, I will be monitoring the chat box. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat, or if you wave your hand, I will see you. And there's also a way to virtually raise your hand on Zoom if you like to use that too. So, okay, let's go ahead and get started.
Are they, Faith, just from my knowledge too, are they all muted on their own? They have the ability to unmute, right?
They do have the ability to unmute to answer questions, and we'll do Q&A at the end. But if you're, I guess I defer to you what you prefer. If you like people to jump in when they are, top of mind.
I'm pretty open, and I want to kind of keep it open, although it's definitely different on a Zoom format, right? So we could be asking questions simultaneously. So maybe if you could just kind of do a little, if I can see your video, hey, I got a question, and I'll ask you to maybe unmute, and you can fire away.
Awesome.
And then at the end we can just open it up. I'm going to do my best not to put anybody to sleep here. It's been a little while since I've done one of these chats. But what I've done in the past is just kind of give a broad overview of what sleep is and why we sleep and what we need out of sleep, and then talk a little bit about what can impact our sleep quality and health, and how that has an overall impact on us, our health, our well-being, all of that. I am going to try to launch a PowerPoint. If it doesn't pop up, and this is really not, again, to bore anybody, this is more to just kind of keep me on track because I have a tendency to bounce around. So I'll try to use this as my guide. A little bit about myself. I've been working for the Concord Hospital for over 20 years. Most of that has been at the Sleep Center. I've been in sleep medicine for almost 30 years. But also am responsible for the respiratory therapy department at Concord Hospital and a couple other smaller areas of the hospital that don't have a whole lot of people in them that are similar to respiratory services, the pulmonary function testing area and things like that. But sleep is really where I got my start in healthcare. That's my passion. Feel like I know sleep pretty well. I'm not a physician. I want to just say that disclaimer right out here. I'm a technologist, polysomnographic technologist, if you want to try a tongue twister. All that means is that for many years, my job was to sit and watch people sleep and record their brain waves and other physiological data so I could try to determine whether or not and provide information to the physicians if they had a sleep disorder and whether or not that was something that we could treat. But in doing that, I've learned a lot about sleep and really find it to be very interesting. So let me see if I can pop this up. Bear with me for a second here. Find my share screen. Pull this up. Faith can tell me if I'm doing something wrong. Can everybody see that?
Yeah, looks good, Brent.
Okay, everybody can see it okay? All right. So again, this is really just to try to keep me on track. And if anybody has questions, please let me know. The one downside, maybe Faith can just keep an eye on the group if she's able to see the whole screen, is now I can only see small boxes on the side and I'd have to scroll down to see who's waving at me. So, if Faith interrupts me because you're looking to ask a question, then I'll know that I need to stop. But let's just talk a little bit about sleep. Again, I want to talk a little bit about the basic biology of sleep. Why is it important? What are some of the things that can be problematic with sleep? Some of those things you're probably familiar with. And then again, how to maybe enhance sleep, since the topic tonight, or the title of tonight's presentation, is Sleep Better Tonight. So I feel a lot of pressure to somehow help you guys all sleep better tonight. So what is sleep? So there's a couple different descriptions, but I think if you ask the average person, what is sleep, they'd say, well, sleep is that thing I do when there's nothing left to do in the day. I got a lot of stuff to do, and sometimes that keeps me up late, and I then I sleep, and then I get up and I start my day all over again. I think as a society have kind of written off the importance of sleep because we're so busy doing so many other things, right? And it's a 24/7 world. Maybe over the last couple of years with the pandemic, that's helped us to slow down a little bit and say, all right, maybe I need more sleep, or I can focus on myself. But I mean, we're all busy. There's lights and screens and all kinds of things that can impact our sleep. But we need it. And one of the docs I work with, one of his favorite sayings when he's asked if sleep is important, he says, well, I don't know anything else that you do with a 30-year life that isn't important. So a lot can happen while you're sleeping. Even though you look at a person asleep, it looks like absolutely nothing's going on. Maybe they twitch, maybe they're murmuring because they're in a dream. But there's a lot of background processes that are happening while you're sleeping. Hormones are being released that are important. You're resetting your daily circadian clock. You're rejuvenating body cells, you're working on your immune system, all these different things, consolidating memory. It's a very, very important process. So it's an inactive and active state. So if you just look at someone, they're obviously just out cold, right? They're not really moving. They appear to not be doing much of anything. But if you look at the brain, and I think I've got a slide here of a PET scan of a person that's asleep, the brain is very active during sleep, surprisingly. There's a couple different states of sleep. There is slow wave sleep, and there is REM sleep, which a lot of you may have heard of, or rapid eye movement sleep. I'll just run down through these. When you're awake, the brain waves look something like in the small box down here. It's a common pattern for everybody's brain. It looks generally the same. When you're looking around, you'll see increasing speed and activity. So wakefulness, the brain is moving very quickly. When you start to fall asleep, this is the first stage of sleep, stage 1 sleep. This is when you're starting to drift off. And when you're laying there in bed and you're just trying to get yourself off to sleep, you're still kind of in tune with some background sounds. If a light gets turned on, you're awake immediately. You don't really know where that transition is. But in your brain, there's really a switch that flips when you fall into sleep. And so you start with this kind of like slow rolling eye movement. If you watched a person, I know it sounds a little creepy, but if you were watching a person falling asleep, you could actually see your eyes begin to roll underneath the eyelids. And eventually you move through this transitional stage of sleep and you move into what's called stage 2 sleep. And you can see the brain waves start to change a little bit, right? Between this change from a fast pattern, now it starts to slow down, but there's not much amplitude to these waves. In stage 2, there's a very specific pattern, these things called K complexes and spindles, that helps us identify people that are working in sleep when a person has hit stage 2 sleep. In stage 2, it's much more difficult to wake you up if a light gets turned on. You might not wake up right away unless you just slipped into stage 2. And we spend a lot of our night in this stage, kind of the meat and potatoes of the sleep stage through the night. After that, and unfortunately as adults, we get a lot less of this. Kids get a ton of slow wave sleep or stage 3 sleep. This is the stage that when you walk into your kid's room and drop something heavy on the floor and it makes a horrible noise and you just assume they're going to jump up. They don't hear anything. They don't move. You can carry a sleeping child off to bed and they don't wake up at all. So your brain really slows down. Breathing becomes very deep and regular. Loud snoring can happen actually during this stage of sleep. And you can be really, really difficult to awake. As a matter of fact, if you are able to be awakened by someone from stage 3, your stage 3 sleep, you're usually very groggy and you don't really, it takes a while to come back into focus. And lastly, there is rapid eye movement sleep. So this is considered a more active state of sleep. This is dream sleep. So when you're having dreams, your eyes are following some kind of visual cue that's being generated in your brain. So they dart around. You can see underneath, again, the eyelids, you can see these sharp movements like you're following things. And it's imagery that you're actually following. If you're awakened during dream sleep, you can often remember that dream. You may not be able to remember it later, but usually if you wake up in the middle of it, you can recall parts of that dream, especially if they're very intense. This also is something that changes through our lifespan. We get more of it when we're younger, and we tend to get a little bit less as we get older, but we don't get zero, because if you got zero, that would be very bad for you. This is a really important stage of sleep. It helps with memory consolidation and a lot of other functions. And that PET scan slide that I was talking about, so this is kind of worded poorly, normal sleep, that should just say non-REM sleep, and then REM sleep. So a PET scan actually shows areas of the brain that are getting activated. So you can see, different than non-REM sleep, there's a lot going on. And it is, you know, all those activities that REM sleep is moving through: memory consolidation, the visual imagery, all that good stuff. And then with all those stages of sleep, why does it matter? Well, through the night, interestingly, there's this real pattern that happens. When you first fall asleep, you go through that kind of slow stage 1 sleep, where you ever have probably had all this experience where you might kick your leg or move your arm really suddenly. It's that sensation of falling asleep. That's called a hypnic jerk. Some people ask if that's normal. It's completely normal. That happens during stage 1 sleep. Then you go off to stage 2 sleep, and then stage 3 sleep. They still list 4 here. Stage 3 is actually combined 3 and 4. That was just a deeper slow wave sleep. And then you pop into REM sleep. And you have one REM cycle, usually about 90 minutes into your sleep period. And then you go through that pattern again, and then you have another REM period, another REM period. So typically, on average, you'll have 3 to 5 of these REM periods through the night. And as the night goes on, they get longer. So usually when you do the majority of your sleeping or dream sleeping and dreaming, it's going to occur in the wee morning hours just before you awaken. Now you can see there's a change as time goes on, and nothing good lasts forever, right? Kids have this pretty solid, easy to follow pattern. Adults, young adults up through 40, 50, it's still pretty consolidated. When we get into our 60s, 70s, 80s, it can be interrupted a lot. You spend a lot of time in bed awake, and there's many reasons for this, and we can talk about that as we get a little further along in this discussion. So what causes sleep, or what controls sleep? Well, there's 2 things primarily, and scientists describe homeostatic sleep pressure and something you guys may be familiar with called the circadian rhythm, which is kind of a 24-hour cycle in our body that guides a whole lot of internal processes. And sleep is part of those processes, but it also helps to control some of the other processes. So this homeostatic drive or sleep pressure is something that they had to name. They had to come up with a descriptor for it. But essentially, when you wake up from sleeping, you're immediately starting to build pressure to sleep again throughout the day. Your brain has an alerting system that pushes back against that pressure, so you don't just wake up and fall right back to sleep. So you're rested. Now this alerting system kicks in. But as the day goes on, that pressure starts to build and pushes back against the alerting system. And usually around 1, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we feel this little dip. It's when our alerting system takes a slight break for about a half an hour, and you need a cup of coffee, or you got to take a short nap, or you're just feeling lethargic. That's very normal. And then, believe it or not, the time that your alerting system is at peak is usually 6 or 7 or 8 o'clock at night, because it's pushing back really hard against that pressure you've been building during the day. But at some point, there's a few systems that help to tip that balance towards sleep. One of them is melatonin, which starts to get emitted or secreted rather from the brain when you get away from light. The melatonin is called a nighttime hormone because at night, when you remove yourself from any bright lights, melatonin will start to kick in. And that helps to prep the body for sleep. So let's go to this next slide here. So what is the purpose of sleep? Well, we don't exactly know, but we do know from lots of studies, longitudinal studies, some immediate short-term sleep deprivation studies, what happens when people don't sleep well or short themselves sleep. So we've done these sleep deprivation studies. We know, and I think everybody here can probably say, yeah, you know what? When I short myself on a given night, if I typically sleep 7 or 8 hours a night, whatever your norm is, if you go below that norm, there's probably an impact. You probably feel a little bit different that day. And it could be that you just feel a little less motivated, a little bit more crabby, a lot of different things it can impact. But there's a lot of memory consolidation that can get impacted too by shorting yourself sleep. How has it changed over time? Well, before we had electricity and before we had all the goodies that we have today that keep us awake all night, people were sleeping 9-10 hours a night. And even in the 60s, the average was about 8 hours per night. Today, because we've just become who we are, the average, if you went across society, is about 6.5 hours that people report they sleep. What does anybody know? And you can unmute yourself if you know this answer. What's recommended? Any thoughts?
I've always heard 8.
Matthew's right. Yeah, 8 is right about where you want to be. 7 and 9 is kind of how they frame it, because you'll have some people that are slightly short sleepers, some people that are slightly long sleepers. They did some interesting studies years ago where they took a group of people and basically sequestered them in a place where they had no expectations, but also no access to clocks and no access to see when it was light and when it wasn't light, and basically said, sleep when you're tired, wake up when you feel like you're done. And overall, the average was about 8.25 hours for most people. Some people do just fine with 7. Some people are shorter than that. Some people say, oh, I'm great with 6 hours. And some people might be kidding themselves and think that they're great with 6 hours, but actually might be surprised if they were able to let themselves sleep a little bit longer, how much better they would be. But there are individual differences like anything.
I have a question, Brett. Can I interject? I am very intrigued by the idea of biphasic sleeping, I think it's called. Some people use the term like second sleep.
Right.
So you sleep for a few hours and then you wake up in the middle of the night and then you go back to sleep. Is that all hooey or is there something to it? I mean, I sometimes I wake up anyway, and I don't know if I'm using that as a way to not feel guilty for getting up in the middle of the night and moving around, or if it really is actually good for you to do that. Could you address that?
Hundreds of years ago, apparently that was how people used to sleep. Because it got dark and they'd go to bed because you could only sit and read by a candlelight for so long, but your body still didn't need 12 hours of sleep. So you would wake up and do things for a couple hours and you'd go back to sleep. I had asked at a conference once, I asked a guy way smarter than me, obviously, to tell me if sleeping 8 hours needed to be consolidated or if it didn't need to be consolidated. And he said, basically, it's the total time that's more important. However, if let's say you take, and rather than doing a biphasic sleep during the overnight hours, you were sleeping 4 hours during the afternoon, 4 hours at night, that's a little bit more challenging because that that pressure, that homeostatic pressure, doesn't really have an adequate time to build up. And so that when we deal with folks that are struggling with some phase delay is one of the sleep disorders that we hear, it's because maybe they've gotten into a pattern that they wake up and then they take a 2-hour to 3-hour nap in the afternoon, and they find themselves at 10 o'clock at night wondering why they can't fall asleep. And so they fall asleep later, and all of a sudden their clock starts to shift, and it gets really hard to get them back on. So again, he said essentially having it all at once is great, but having the total of 8 hours is super important, but you can get really out of rhythm, and that's problematic. We'll talk a little bit about napping and when it's appropriate and when it's not, and how it can benefit you. So talk about health factors with sleep debt. So if there's many reasons that you could be sleeping a shorter period of time. It's not always just because you're making that choice. You might have a sleep disorder. You might have things going on in your life that prevent you from sleeping. You know, you might, if you're a parent of a newborn, certainly that there's not much you can do about that. You're going to be up and down. So there's times when this is totally normal, but long-term sleep debt can impact cardiovascular health. Even short-term sleep debt can impact your hunger and your diet. It can cause metabolic changes, like short sleep alone is a risk factor for diabetes. It certainly can cause impaired cognition, even on a one-night thing, right? If you sleep 4 hours instead of sleeping your normal 8, you're not thinking clearly. You might be for the first hour, but after that it's lost. Mood imbalance, and certainly drowsy driving is a big risk factor, an immediate risk factor, and happens to a lot of people. So let's talk about these short-term and let's talk about these long-term. So a couple of the hormones that are secreted while you sleep are leptin and ghrelin, which are hormones that impact your appetite and your satiation. So they get out of balance. If you sleep too short, you can have lower levels of leptin, which is the hormone that tells you, hey, you're all set. You ate enough. You don't need to eat anymore. And you can have higher levels of ghrelin, which drives your appetite. And usually it'll drive your appetite towards fatty or sugary things. So in the short run, big deal, right? 1 or 2 days. But if you have chronic sleep debt, that's problematic, because sleep debt alone has been proven over several studies in the last 10 years to be an independent risk factor for obesity. And that's just something to keep in mind. Long-term changes, it can impact your body's ability to process sugar, so it can get stored as fat. So that's where that metabolic change can come in. And mood imbalance, you know, that 1 day or 1 night sleep deprivation can turn into really significant and long-term mood imbalances that need to be addressed. And unfortunately, a lot of times when you're doing that, especially with medications, that can also impact your sleep negatively. So we try really hard to fix people's sleep without trying to provide medication if we can do that. If there's a short-term issue, we try to address it, but providing medication for sleep disorders for a long period of time isn't necessarily the best thing to do. So just a couple other little tidbits. This is a little dated, and I apologize, but this hasn't changed much in the last. So a lot of people out there on the road, you may have seen this or encountered it yourself. Most of us have probably had a time where we felt sleepy while we were driving. But this was over a 1-year period. People were asked, have you fallen asleep at the wheel? And 37% of people responding said they had fallen asleep at the wheel. Now that can be for a second or it can be for 5 seconds. But if you're driving down the highway at 65 miles an hour, it doesn't take much longer than 2 or 3 seconds to wind up in the ditch. I was driving back from Vermont this summer with my family, and there was a car right in front of me in the left-hand lane that just went right down into the median. And it was a low median, and I really was expecting to either see something really bad or a tree move or something. So I pulled off into the breakdown lane, and amazingly, he came back up out, stopped, then came across. He saw I stopped and pulled behind me. And I walked back just to make sure he wasn't having some kind of a medical issue. And he had fallen asleep at the wheel. And he said, you know, one exit before, I was trying to see if there was maybe a rest area coming up, and I just couldn't hold it together. He was driving back to Nashua. And so I told him the next exit had a spot where he could pull off and sleep. But it doesn't take long, and it can be really, really bad, obviously, especially when you're on the highway. And fighting it is useless. As a person that used to work third shift and drive a fair distance after that, I tried all the tricks of slapping my face and rolling down the window and turning up the music. It doesn't work when your body really has been pushed to the limit. So it's better to just pull over and take a quick nap. It'll probably be the difference between making it home and crashing up your car. A lot of public health or industrial accidents, rather, that have happened due to sleep deprivation. 3 Mile Island, the Valdez, even the Long Island or Staten Island ferry, rather. These were all accidents that at the end of the day, they linked to people just not sleeping enough. It had pretty big impacts. So what are some of these causes? Again, self-induced sleep restriction. I've got to get stuff done. I can't. I'm going to have to sleep 6.5 hours tonight. I'm going to have to sleep 5 hours tonight, whatever it is. But also just poor sleep hygiene. And we can talk about sleep hygiene. The word shouldn't be equated with whether or not we took a shower that day. It's simply about how do you treat your bedroom and how do you treat sleep? So if you go off to bed and you plop down with your laptop and you start firing off emails or working on things, there's 2 things working against you. One is you're starting to equate your bedroom and your bed specifically with a place that you do work, not where you relax. And really, it should just be reserved for the place that you go in and go to bed, or for intimate activities. I mean, that's really what the bedroom is supposed to be for. The other thing that works against you is we're all staring at a screen right now, and that's shooting off, unless we've got special glasses, that's giving us a whole lot of light at a particular spectrum that starts to push back against that release of melatonin. So if we do that late into the evening, it pushes back against melatonin so that it's more of a trickle than kind of a cascade. So trying to avoid bright screens close to bedtime, maybe within a half an hour, highly advised. Bright lights, overhead lights, if you can start to dim those, that's going to help you quite a bit. There's also primary sleep disorders. We deal with this at the Sleep Center. Obstructive sleep apnea is a big one. That's a breathing issue that's closely related to snoring. Snoring is kind of benign and annoying to the other person in the room, but sleep apnea is its bigger brother, which is where your airway is closing off and you're not getting enough oxygen, and your brain goes, hey, open your airway, and your muscles contract, but they can only do that when you wake up for a short period of time. It's a big sleep stealer, and it also is a big cardiovascular risk. But there's also restless legs, and the biggest sleep disorder, insomnia, which we've probably all had at one point in time, either transitional insomnia, where I just had a rough 3 days because I was super stressed out, or chronic, which is really painful for people that suffer with that. Illnesses, either chronic or acute, if they're short-term or long-term, sometimes those can steal your sleep. Also, body aches and pains, and maybe even just a poor mattress might impact your sleep as well. So, and also some medications can impact your sleep, and we can talk a little bit more about that. So what are some things that we can do to promote better sleep? Some of these things are going to seem old-fashioned, but your bedroom should really be dark, quiet, cool. If it's too warm, your internal temperature is one of the things that helps to flip that switch into sleep, which is one of the reasons why they recommend not doing anything too active really close to bed, like extensive exercise where it raises your core temperature, because it might push back against your ability to fall asleep. free of interruptions. So, TV, a lot of us have TVs in our rooms or computers and things like that. The one thing about TV, I talk to a lot of people that say, no, I need it to fall asleep. And I get that, it's background noise. But what you don't realize is that those commercials pop in really loud, right? They're designed to do that and be above the volume of whatever show you're watching, and that'll interrupt your sleep. Using white noise like a fan or white noise generating machines are helpful. Humidifiers are great because if you get congested because your room's super dry, especially this time of year, that might bring on some of those breathing issues. If you do work third shift, I used to do this and it was really corny, but boy, did it work. I wore those really silly eye shades over my eyes because any amount of light would wake me up instantly. So that was the only way I could do it. And I wore earplugs because the traffic noise was more expensive. The aches and pains, body aches and pains can definitely fragment your sleep. So evaluating your mattress, and one of those ways, like if you go to stay at a friend's house or if you go to stay at a hotel and you go, geez, I slept really good. That was amazing. It might be your mattress. You might need a new mattress or something different for you. It's amazing how much that can wake you up. More and more, I have shoulder and hip stuff going on and just wakes me up in the middle of the night so I can reposition, probably even more than I know. So going to sleep when you're truly tired is also really a good thing. And here's the reason. Many people that have insomnia report that they really try to force themselves to sleep more, right? And if you go in, it's just like doing work in your bed. You go in and try to force yourself to get to bed earlier because you know you're going to have a lousy night's sleep. It's going to get frustrating because you're going to lay there for a really long period of time without being able to sleep. And again, it's going to reinforce psychologically that it's a frustrating process getting off to bed. I get asked this a lot. Is it important to stick to a routine, bedtime and wake time? The truth is, yes. The reality is it's hard to do that. Of those two, the most important is to make sure that you're waking up at the same time. And it always has to do with that sleep pressure. If you normally sleep 10 to 6, 10 to 6, 10 to 6, and then you sleep 2 to 10 because you're trying to get the same amount of sleep, that night, you're going to struggle getting off to sleep. So waking up and short sleeping yourself for that one day is better than trying to fight yourself back over time, because it really can be a challenge. So trying to wake as close to the same time as you can every day is a big benefit. Exercise is great for everything, and it does play into that circadian rhythm. You just don't want to do it too close to bedtime. I would say 3 hours or more is advised because it gives your body time to cool down and allow it to fall off to sleep. Balancing fluid intake, that's really about, if you consume too much liquid close to bedtime, you're obviously going to get up and go to the bathroom a fair amount. Speaking of liquids, I think I get into it here. So there's a couple things that can really impact your sleep. Caffeine, obviously. I love coffee. I definitely live by it in the morning. I try not to have it after 12 noon because it hangs around for a long time. It really has a long half-life. So if you have a cup of coffee at night, even if you've been really good about your bedtime and your wake time, caffeine's really going to push back. It's going to push back and promote that alerting system so that the melatonin can't do its job. Nicotine is another stimulant. So unfortunately, that works against you as well. So the closer you're utilizing a nicotine product close to bed, that's going to work against you. And alcohol gets used, really gets misused as a sleep aid. And there's the reliable understanding for that is that to fall asleep, sometimes we need to let go of all the stuff that's going on in our lives, right? And so that alcoholic beverage might help to do that. It decreases stress, allows us to kind of forget about certain things. Problem with it, especially when it's used close to bedtime, is that as alcohol gets metabolized, it triggers that alerting system in your brain. And so you're trying to sleep, but it's kicking in your alerting system. So you end up having about 4 hours after going to bed, a lot of arousals, and you don't know why. It also, as a central nervous system depressant, if you have a sleep breathing disorder, if you tend to snore, I guarantee when you have a couple of beers close to bedtime, it's gonna be 10 times as loud, and you might even trip into that sleep apnea realm a little bit.
Brett, before we move on, we do have a question in the chat here.
Oh, sorry.
Matthew says this is about teeth grinding at night. So Matthew says dentists often say go for a sleep study. What can be learned from a sleep study to stop grinding one's teeth at night?
Teeth grinding typically happens during particular stages of sleep, but it can go on all night, and it can actually cause a lot of awakenings. So when we look at that, I just showed you that one little, I wish I could show you what a whole sleep study looks like. One of the things we monitor is your jaw muscles and how much that is getting activated. It tells us two things. When you fall into REM sleep, those things go pretty much inactive. But if you grind your teeth, if you have bruxism, we see it through the night. And if we can see you grinding your teeth and then having an awakening, grinding your teeth and having an awakening, it can be problematic to your sleep. So treating it can be a lot more challenging. Truthfully, taking care of your, making sure that the dentist provides you with something that's a grind guard is a really big help. But it's something that can be a little bit challenging. Is that something you deal with, Matthew, with grinding?
Yeah. Our teeth have the show of wear, and they bring up the guard every time. And it's just, they always say go to a sleep study, but it's just nice to know. Like, I'm glad that I asked you, because you gave the answer that there really is nothing to be learned at the sleep study. Like, it sounds like you just map it, and it's like, great, well, I already knew that. And
right.
Well, that's about it.
No, I think that is important. There's a lot more knowledge about sleep than there was, but sometimes people can get fixated on testing. So if they were to assume, sometimes dentists are really good because they'll look not only at your teeth, but they'll look in the back of your airway and they might go, wow, that's really crowded. And I worry that you might have sleep apnea, and maybe that's what's causing you to do some of this grinding. You can have primary bruxism, or you can also grind your teeth because something else is causing that. Just looking at you, I've only got from the shoulders up. You don't look like someone that typically has sleep apnea. You look like your neck size is normal. Do you snore? Not to get personal.
Yes.
You do?
Yeah.
So that would be the one thing that I think they might be leaning towards, is maybe the bruxism isn't primary. Maybe it's that you actually are doing some level of snoring and that's bringing this on. So that would be the one thing that you could tell the difference from. Now there's a couple different, if you came into the office and said, a dentist wants me to be seen, and we're going to talk more about your breathing and the snoring and things like that. And we usually do what's called a home sleep test to rule out sleep apnea first and foremost, because if you have sleep apnea, almost everything else that follows it might be impacted if we treat that. So we start there. It's like peeling layers of the onion. Sometimes people have sleep apnea and we fix that and they do great. The breathing looks good, but all of a sudden we notice that they're still kicking their legs, or maybe they are bruxing. Then there might be, that might not have been the issue. And you're basically down to, gee, I still brux and I need my mouth guard. But sometimes it might just be secondary to that primary sleep disorder, breathing or sleep breathing disorder.
In a sleep study, is there ever any review of like a person's muscle tone, their flexibility? Like, I had a difficult childbirth. I was a premature baby. I landed on my head hard when I was playing basketball at age 12. So I've always been a very tight person. And I've done about 25 years of yoga, and I've relaxed. I'm actually more flexible at 54 than I was at, say, 24.
Yeah.
It's been just an incredible amount of work, but just loosening up the muscles, especially like the scalenes right here. Like I used to, if I would floss, when I floss, I would gag, and I've almost eliminated that completely. There's no more reflex for that. And but that's something you can't talk about to the dentist because it's not in their books.
Right.
What do you guys do for muscle, Tom Brady, TB12 pliability? That like a person that's flexible is going to sleep better than a person that's tight as a
Agreed.
right?
Yep. Agreed. No, I think, and one of the relaxation techniques sometimes people use to fall asleep is doing some stretching and or muscle activation, release, those kind of things. We don't deal a whole lot with that, Matthew. Honestly, if we felt like you were having something like that, it might be more of a neurology consult. And there are some neurologists that also do sleep medicine as well. But all we can really see is whether or not you have muscle activation during times of sleep when we wouldn't expect you to. And that's probably less about your overall flexibility and more related to what's kicking that in. There's a sleep disorder called REM behavior disorder, which is a really rare but problematic disorder where people act out their dreams. Usually when you're in REM sleep, your muscle tone is as low as it can possibly be in a 24-hour cycle. But we'll see these little flecks of muscle tone during that. That usually is treated with a medication, but it's not really related to pliability. It's more a neurological condition. Yeah. You're doing the right thing going and doing yoga, though. That's fantastic. I need to get more flexible myself.
You have to put in 1,000 hours of work to get a tiny little benefit.
And it's so hard. It's like anything else, right? It's just like exercise, it's the motivation to get there. But once you start feeling those benefits, what a huge difference. Was there other chats there too, Faith?
Not just now, but I will keep an eye on it.
Okay, gotcha. All right, so eating, a lot of people ask, is there better foods to eat? You just don't want to eat too close to bedtime. It's the big thing. If you do eat a very heavy carbohydrate-based meal and then fall asleep, that's probably not outstanding because the amount of glucose that gets released into your bloodstream is then going to get stored as fat. So, but that's more about just don't eat at 9 o'clock and go to bed at 9:15 because you need to burn some of those sugar molecules that you dropped. This is, a little bit of what we were talking about with stretching, but establishing a regular relaxing bedtime routine. So some people like to read before they go to bed. Some people like to do, if you go back to the classic, should I have a glass of warm milk? It's not about what it is. It's about a routine, because you're really trying to train your brain that, oh, this is what I do before you shut down. If you do things that are super stimulating, you're watching a very scary movie or you're engaged in a really interesting conversation with someone, it's hard to shut your brain off because it's still working. It's part of what causes insomnia, transient insomnia, when you wake up during the night and your brain just starts going because you got something important the next day. So having a routine allows you to prep yourself for bedtime better and sticking to that routine. An alarm clock, if you do have a tendency to be a clock watcher, man, that can be so miserable, because if you intended to wake up at 6:30 in the morning and you wake up and you see it's 5 and you tell yourself, I won't fall back asleep, you won't fall back asleep. It's just a self-fulfilling prophecy. You might drift, but then you open your eyes back up and you realize only 5 minutes passed and you get frustrated. So try to reliably, if you're used to using an alarm clock, a lot of us use our phones now, put it in a place where you can't readily reach it, so that if you wake up and you're tempted to check it, you can't do it without getting out of bed. Just try to fall back asleep and know that your alarm clock will wake you up when you need to get up, right? And then again, maintaining a regular bedtime and wake schedule is very helpful. Mostly that wake schedule more than anything. It's about all I have on this presentation. I'd definitely like to open it up to just open conversations or questions. Looks like Matt's got one. Go for it.
At the beginning, you were talking about brain waves. I've always wondered, what exactly is that? Do your brain waves actually leave, actually go out a certain distance into the world?
It's a measure of electrical activity, actually. We call them waves, but your neurons, when they're firing, they move in either positive or negative polarity directions. And we measure that as a wave above and below zero. So you've got, and it's kind of odd. I'll see if I can go back to that slide, but it's upside down. See if I can find it. So if I was to draw a center line right through one of these patterns, that would be zero polarity. An upward deflection is a negative deflection. Doesn't make any sense, but that's the way it works in an EEG device. And a downward is a positive deflection. But it's not, waves is probably not the best way. We just call it waves because it's wave forms that we see on paper, but it's electrical activity that we're measuring.
One time,
microscopic electrical signals too.
There's a place in Burlington, Massachusetts that had a sensory deprivation tank, and I get like a 3-pack, and it's a lot of fun, if that's the right word, just to experience something different. And you could give the option of having alpha, delta, and gamma waves presented to you. And,
Yeah.
It sounds really nice. What is happening when those waves are, when you're listening to that?
So it was a what do you call it? So it's auditory waveforms at a certain frequency. Is that what's going on?
Yeah, kind of like music. I mean, it sounds
Yeah.
nice, but it's of those 3 waves.
I don't know. I really don't know what's actually happening. I would imagine that if you chose one, there must be one that allows you to relax better. I don't know a whole lot about the sensory deprivation process, but it sounds pretty interesting. Was it one where you laid in water, or was it just?
Yeah, it's a tank about the size of a piece of plywood, maybe, and it's 10 inches of water, about 95 degrees, and 1,000 pounds of Epsom salt.
Yeah.
And so you close the door so there's no light, but you can turn on a light if you want. And then you float effortlessly. Not the first time. It takes a little bit of practice, but to get the salt out of your eyes.
Oh, right.
But once you get in the zone, your body just completely disappears because you can't see anything. And it's like you don't even feel your body. It's like your mind is like free for the first time in your life.
Yeah. Seems like it would be the ultimate meditation opportunity, right? Because nothing else is really going. Perhaps that's white noise for the brain, those auditory waves. I mean, when I go to bed, I use a white noise machine, and I can tell, and I sleep better when it's at a particular tone. I don't do as well when it's too high pitched or too low pitched. And so I'll go adjust it if it's not helping me. And it's a weird kind of like calming sensation. Yep, that's it. That's as loud as I want it. And that's where it is. And that background noise doesn't just drown out the background, sound. It also, to me, gives me something to focus on. That's nothing. And that to fall asleep, again, it's a process of disengaging from everything, disengaging from the environment, disengaging from your thoughts. And if you still are linked into any of those things, you can't fall asleep. You can't focus on anything that's, changing. It's got to be just one placid thing. So I would imagine in the sensory deprivation tank, it gives you that same opportunity to just disconnect from everything, any kind of environmental cue that might chase your brain in a different direction, right? Sounds fun. I would do that.
Just one copy.
Oh, cool. I didn't know that.
Brett, we do have a question from Kathy, who asks, any advice on what to try when you do wake up early?
When you do wake up early and can't get back to sleep, I'm assuming.
Kathy, is that what you meant? Let's unmute you here.
Yes.
Ah.
So give me an example, Kathy. You go to bed with hopes of waking up at a certain time, but you wake up too early, or is it the middle of the night?
I'm early to bed, early to rise, and very comfortable with that. But early to rise should be 4 a.m. and I wake up at 2 or 3.
Yeah. Is that a regular nightly occurrence or just once in a while?
Too often to make me uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yep. So you might be, when you say early to bed, what time are you talking?
8, before 8, 7:30 to 8.
7:30 to 8, and your goal is to sleep out till 4. So you
Till
get about
4.
8.
Yeah. And
So you
that 3 o'clock wake up is like, oh, damn.
Yeah. And what do you do when you wake up at that hour? Do you lay there and try to fall back asleep?
Yeah. And toss and turn. And
Yeah.
I heard you about the clock. I'll turn the clock away, but 3:15, 3:30, 3:45. Okay, I can get up.
And historically, have you been an 8-hour a night sleeper?
Yes, or more.
Or more? Okay. I mean, are any naps during the day?
No,
No naps during the day.
I'm not a good napper. If I
Yeah.
nap, I'm shot.
Yeah. So it could be, I mean, typically our sleep overall time needs for that don't really change through our lifetime. Usually what happens is that you have things impacting your ability to get that total time, and you're on the other end of the spectrum where I'm in bed 8 hours and I think I'm sleeping that entire time, but I don't really sleep that entire time. You're on the other end where it sounds like you're waking up and you're waking up early. When you wake up, do you feel like you're awake? Do you feel like, yeah, I can just get up?
So I do sometimes get up, and there I am at 3 in the morning, which then renders me at 3 in the afternoon, a tired puppy.
Exactly. And that's why I asked about the napping, because sometimes the crutch can then become, I got to lay down because I'm so tired. And then again, you're skewing that sleep pressure a little bit because you're pushing back against it. You're resolving some of it in your 1 hour of napping. But if you're not doing that, you're fighting through and then heading off to bed. What you might want to try for a period of time is going to bed a little bit later. Try maybe going to bed at 8:30 and see if you're able to sleep through 2-4. Maybe you're sleeping really well and your sleep needs are a little shorter. If not, if you're still waking up at 2:30, 3, you might have something else going on. So as an example, sleep apnea is very common. I don't know if anybody's ever talked to you about it or not, but I mean, when you have sleep apnea, usually it's at its worst. You can have really benign sleep apnea, but it's at its worst when you're in REM sleep. And I would imagine if you're going to bed at 8 and you're trying to get up at 4, that period between 2 and 4, you might be in REM sleep at that time. And maybe you're having some sleep breathing stuff that's waking you up. And if you're holding your breath, there's a little bit of adrenal response that can kick in. So you wake up and you're like, ooh, I'm really awake. I don't think I can get back to sleep. Do you sleep on your back, your side, stomach?
Back.
So usually sleep apnea is worse on its back, just because gravity's working against you. But if you're like me, I like to sleep on my side, but when I do, my shoulders start to hurt. So it gets to be You could try positional therapy and see if maybe if I can force myself to be on my back, you can maybe prop a pillow behind the small of your back, or force myself to be on my side. Maybe I can sleep a little better. Maybe I find I sleep better.
And your suggestion about staying up later has worked in the past. When I've watched a show to the finish, I have had a better sleep.
Yeah, and for people that complain about insomnia and maintenance insomnia is what you're describing, we frequently will say, all right, like when do you go to bed? When do you wake up? What's your total time in bed? All right, the first thing I want you to do is shorten that, because we're trying to consolidate your sleep. Because if you're up and down and up and down and up and down, you might be in bed for 10 hours, but really only sleeping 7 hours. So we just try to take that 3 hours away at the beginning of the night. Say, don't get into bed at 8 o'clock. You're going to go to bed at, 10 o'clock instead of 8.
Yeah.
And see if that helps to consolidate your sleep and allow you to sleep longer. And then usually once you do that, then you can start slowly stretching it back out again, but you don't want to do it in a one-night jump.
Thank you.
Yeah, give it a try. Here's one thing that'll help, and we use it all the time. If you're ever wondering what's going on, keeping a sleep log can really help.
Yes.
And so for if you want to do it for a week, 2 weeks, we usually ask people to collect 2 weeks worth of data. But we ask people to record, when did you go to bed? When do you wake up? What did you eat? When did you eat? Did you exercise that day? How much light exposure do you have that day? That's something I didn't have in this presentation, but I can't.
Your comment about caffeine at noon was helpful. Yes.
Yeah, no, it really can impact that.
It can.
But also, one of the things that helps to set our clocks for sleep, our internal clock, is light exposure. And certainly as we get older and as we get into the winter months, getting access to, it can be any light, but sunlight's the best. That helps to set your clock. It heads right through your optic nerve to the pons and helps to reset that circadian rhythm. And sometimes we avoid those bright light scenarios in the morning, which is really when we should have it, first thing when you wake up. So we'll use bright light therapy also.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? There's a couple great websites I can direct you guys to for more information. Healthysleep.org is a Harvard website. There's some really bright folks down there that put together some pretty cool videos that help to talk about some of the things we talked about tonight. I'm blanking on the other one, but there's if you do a general Google search, there's some pretty good informational sites out there, but the Harvard education site is pretty awesome.
If you do wake up in the middle of the night and it's 4 or 5 hours before you're supposed to get up, should you get up and read, or just not sit there and say, oh, I'm going to get back to sleep. I'm going to get back to sleep?
A great question. And that gets asked a lot. And the truth is that on a one-night basis, there may not be a right or wrong answer. However, if that's an ongoing problem, laying in bed and being frustrated can be problematic. So we tend to tell folks not to do that for longer than 30 minutes. If you're laying there for 30 minutes and you're not getting to sleep, you can get up, try to do something mundane, not anything real high impact. Don't turn all the lights on in the house. Don't plop down in front of the TV, but maybe just going in, sitting in a low light situation, reading if you like to read, or doing something very mundane, like I'm going to go sweep the kitchen real quick, then I'm going to lay back down. Those things can be helpful. Yeah, laying there can be really frustrating. And again, it just reinforces the fact that, gee, the bedroom's a lousy place for me. I don't sleep well, but that's not really what's going on.
Brett, this was awesome. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks. You're very welcome. It's always nice to talk about this stuff. And I really appreciate your time.
Oh gosh, we appreciate yours too. Likewise. Does anyone have any last questions to wrap it up before we head off for the night for awesome night's sleep?
It was great. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you guys. I appreciate it. Have a great night. Nice meeting you all.
All right. Thank you, Brett. Have a wonderful night, everyone. Thanks for coming. Bye-bye.
Thank you.